Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for the short introduction. Yes, welcome. And this is one of the toughest spots of the day because it's just before the closing keynote. And you've all heard a lot of talk today, so I appreciate that even more that you joined. So we're going to talk about Selenium Grid for the next 45 minutes. We've already heard something about Selenium Grid this morning. Everybody was at the opening keynote, right? That was also about Selenium Grid. So potentially we will hear some stuff that was already said before today. If you look on your little program, it actually says building a scalable and reliable infrastructure. I actually changed it to designing, because what I realized along the way when I put the presentation together is that I'm actually not going to tell you how to build it. 45 minutes is a little bit short to build something like that. What I'd like to do, however, is give you pointers of the things that you should consider when you decide for a Selenium Grid solution, right? There's different paths out there. We're going to look at those today. And it's just important to understand the implications of that, right? So we'll go through that one by one. But first of all, who has never used Selenium in this room? Okay, no? Okay, well, perfect. That's why you're sitting in the first row. That's the best, the best seat right there. So everybody else has worked with Selenium. What about Selenium Grid? Anybody who hasn't worked with Selenium Grid? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so there's a little bit of know-how there by people who have used it. And I'm assuming those people who have worked with Selenium Grid have built their own. Is that correct? Is that a correct assumption? Yeah, okay. What's the one word that how you would summarize that experience in building your own Selenium Grid? Painful. Not building. Building is actually fun, right? It's the it's the maintenance part. Anyway, so I want to show you today, from my experience, what the things are that you should consider when you either build it or you find maybe even another solution than building. But before we go into that, just a real quick introduction. So I'm one of the co-founders of Element 34 Solutions. We're based in Switzerland, just about half an hour south of Zurich. And it's perfectly okay if you don't know us. But any idea why we're called Element 34? And not 33 or 35? Probably Selenium, exactly. So for those of you who were good in chemistry, Selenium is the 34th element of the periodic table, right? So this is what we do with our company. And actually, one thing, I'm going to spare you the big introduction of our 20-year company history, which we don't have. But this is basically how I would summarize it. So actually, François Renaud, who is the co-founder of the company, we spent more than 10 years working for eBay. And during that time, we actually developed and open sourced Selenium Grid. And then it became part of the Selenium project, right? So there's a little bit of us in everybody who uses Selenium Grid. And then we also invented the Selenium box. I'm going to come to that that's going to be my very last slide. But basically, this is what we do. We're specialized in Selenium, and we've done a lot of this. Customer comes to the point where you have too many tests and then you need to run them in parallel and all of that stuff, right? So that's when when the question starts kicking in, do you need a Selenium Grid? And if you do, then what's the best way to go with that? But before we actually dive into Selenium, I just want to make a few statements. And one of them is, we live in an agile world. Is anybody in this room who doesn't work in an agile team? or whose management doesn't believe that they're working in an agile team? Everybody's sort of agile, I'm assuming, right? Or everybody wants to be that. And that's okay, because whether whether you do all those rituals or not, it doesn't really matter. The point is the world is spinning faster and faster. And so what was okay maybe 10 years ago to have 6-month or 12-month release cycles, today 2 weeks seem long, because everybody wants to get to that continuous delivery, continuous deployment stage. Yeah? So you need fast feedback. And I strongly believe that if you are able to create fast feedback of your product, in whichever way that is, right? That's not just test automation. That's also just talking to your clients, being like, hey, what is this? Do you like it? Is this what you want? If you have those fast feedback cycles, you will probably build better products, or at least products that your customers like and that they're willing to pay for. Right? And in the end, that's what we all do. We want to delight our customers with products that they buy, and make sure that our paycheck at the end of the month comes in. Yeah. So that, and then if we narrow it down a little bit more into the test automation space, test automation is, of course, one of the key enablers of fast feedback cycles. Right? Because there's no way you can test your product by hand with every developer commit. Right? That's probably not going to work. Yeah? So you need a mechanism to run automated tests or checks. There's a big discussion sometimes whether it should be called checks or tests. I call them tests. So if you don't like that, you can just replace that with checks. So that's basically what enables fast feedback cycles. One of the key enablers. And now, are you mainly developers? Who's developer in this room? Okay, testers, the rest. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a developer or a tester or something in between, right? I think also that's the other thing in the Agile world. Those two functions oftentimes kind of mingle. Which is good. It's a good thing. And but when you automate tests, what you actually want is you want to focus on the creation of the test, right? Because that's where you're good at. That's what you know. You know the domain. You know what should be tested, and then you execute those tests. Yeah. And that should be as painless as possible, of course, right? That execution part. And now we're starting to come closer to the issue, right? Maybe can somebody describe what Selenium Grid does? Do we have a microphone? No? Oh, I didn't just ask whether somebody can describe it. Of course, if you raise your hand, you have to tell us. So, Selenium Grid allows to run tests in parallel. Right? The problem with Selenium tests, and it's not Selenium, it has nothing to do with Selenium, it's just the space that Selenium tests are in, which are on the UI level, right? So they take a long time. Right? A unit test you can run in a few milliseconds. UI browser-based tests, you have to spin up the browser, you have everything available, and that takes a lot of time. Right? So, in my experience, the average Selenium test takes between 30 seconds and 1.5 minutes. Yeah. Now, that's fine if you have 1 test, or 2 tests, or 5 tests. But if you want to have 100 tests or 1,000 tests and you start running them sequentially, that's going to take a long time. And that takes you away from those fast feedback cycles. Yeah? So what you need is a mechanism to basically say, okay, I have 1,000 tests here, and I can push them into my system, and they are going to be executed in parallel, ideally. Yeah? Or at least more than one at the same time. And now the setup for that is something like this. Can you see that? It looks a bit dark. over here. So in the end, maybe we start from the right side. This is your application under test, what you want to test in the end. And over here, these are your tests. Right? So you can kick them off from the development environment directly. You can run them from the QA department, for example. You can kick them, of course, from a CI system. I mean, that's ideally what happens every time somebody commits something. You kick off the whole battery of tests, or you can run them from the command line. So that's all fine. This is exactly the creation part of the tests, right? And then you want to run that against here. And in the middle is this thing here, which is called the Selenium Grid, right? It's a browser farm where you can push in your tests. Oops, sorry. Where you can push in your tests. And you have all these browsers available that you need, right? Maybe in different versions, different operating systems, because we also heard in one of the talks before, you know, the visual part is very important, so it does make a difference whether you run on a Chrome or on a Safari, for example. So there's not only functional differences, but also maybe visual differences, right? So it's important to be able to run your 100 tests maybe on 5 different browsers, actually, right? So which just multiplies the number of tests. So that's basically what you need, this infrastructure to run your tests in parallel. Now, this you can build yourself, right? That's in the open source package of Selenium. If you download Selenium, you just start the server in grid mode, and within 5 minutes max, you can have a little grid. You can do that. The problem with this is, of course, that every time a new browser version is released, or every time a new Gecko driver is released. Who has had fun in the last few weeks or months with Gecko driver? Yeah. So you need to make sure that all those updates, right, the drivers, the browsers, and also the Selenium versions are actually incorporated into this architecture or into this infrastructure. And there's a lot of tools that are available now that were not available a few years ago, like just one thing, Docker, for example, right? Docker makes things easier, virtualization makes things easier. Nevertheless, just to give you a pointer, if you work, or our clients, what we see in big companies, they sometimes have 2 to 3 people full-time doing nothing other than maintaining a homegrown Selenium Grid, which is a fairly large investment for something that, you know, in the end, where you want to focus your people is here and here, not in building and maintaining browser infrastructure. You know? So that's one alley that you can go, and we're going to talk about the implications of that after I show you the other alley, which is the cloud. Yeah. So there are providers out there that basically take this and put it into their cloud and offer it as a service to you. Right? So you can just say, hey, cool, I'm not going to do this all in my own infrastructure anymore. I just basically send the tests to the cloud, to this Selenium Grid in the cloud, and all the magic is done there. You can do that. Those services are out there. There's multiple of them once, right? So Browser Stack, Sauce Labs, and there's new ones coming up all the time. Now, what's the what could be the problem with this? Anybody works in a bank here? Now you need to speak. Is this something that is likely to be allowed by your bank's infrastructure guys? Probably not. So as I said, we live in Switzerland. Switzerland is the land of banks and francs. That's what they always say. And so, of course, a lot of our clients are banks and insurances and that. And there, going outside of your own infrastructure is an absolute no-go, right? So that solution to go to the cloud is perfectly viable for any company where security, or where does the data reside, where do you send your data to. If you're a small startup, that's probably not an issue. Right? If you're a big bank, that is an issue. So, but nevertheless, it's a very viable option. And now what I want to go through is what you should think about when you think about this, and parallel to that when you think about that. Yeah? Both have pros and cons, like everything else in life, right? So we're going to look at that. So maybe just first the things that I believe should be thought about. This is probably not a final list, but just a few things. So security, we already talked about that, right? I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. Security is one thing. Maintenance, right? So how much of your engineering time do you need to spend in building and maintaining an infrastructure? Scalability, big point. Often completely forgotten and overseen when people start out with these kind of systems. Performance, right? I mean, we already said these tests are not the fastest ones to begin with. Now you need to look at the different implications. Are they running slower when you go one way or the other way? Price. Right? Nothing's free in life. Very important, I think, to mention here. If you build it yourself, a lot of companies think that it's free, but they still need to pay you, right? And there's an opportunity cost where you don't do something that really matters, right? So that, and then of course when you go to the cloud, yeah, well, they are not a charity either, so you need to pay them. Yeah. So pricing aspects. Also, what kind of reporting and monitoring tools you have when you go one way or the other, and then also what is it actually that you want to test. Right? Do you only care about browsers? Do you care about mobile? If so, is it okay to test on emulators, or do you need to test on real devices? All those kind of things. Yeah. All right. So now let's start out with security. And there's really not much more to say about that, except that when you use a cloud provider, you have to go outside of your network. Yeah, it's as simple as that. And depending on where these providers are, they may be in the US, they may be in India, they may be, wherever those companies are set up. But that essentially means that you make an HTTP request with a whole bunch of data going out of your network to that cloud provider. They spin up the browser, and then they come back into your QA environment to spin up the application under test. And that's the problem. Going out is maybe not the problem so much, but actually coming back in. Yeah. So I've seen a lot of companies saying, hey, cool, there's these cloud guys out there, let's just do it, right? And then after 3 months, they talk to their information security department, and they're like, no, not gonna happen, yeah? So probably better if you think about it yourself, or if you think about it a bit before you actually start. Of course, when you have everything in-house, then that's no problem, right? Everything lives in your own infrastructure, so no problem at all. Maintenance. We kind of touched on that as well, right? Now here, the really great thing about cloud is no maintenance at all. You just pay them, right? But in the end, they do all the maintenance for you. That's what you pay for, right? So when there's a problem with Gecko driver not doing what it's supposed to do, or crashing the test, or then that's not your problem. Yeah. So that's really, really cool about these cloud solutions. When you decide to do this in-house, it is your problem, and it becomes a really, really big problem, right? So I always say building these systems is fun, right? That's cool engineering work. So everybody who who likes to build systems, that's a pretty cool thing to do. But when you're kind of done with that, and then the grid goes into operation, and then every 2 or 3 days there's a new Chrome browser, there's a new Firefox browser, there's new drivers, etc. Right? Then you're still on the hook, right? To bring all those images in and make sure that they work, right? And make sure that they work together with what you already have, etc. Right? So that is really something that a lot of people underestimate, and I fully understand why they underestimate. It's because because it's so easy to set up a Selenium grid to start with, right? You can really in 5 minutes max we can build one here, right? So that is really a bit of a disappointment later on when you start building your system. Adding more and more browsers, adding more and more capability in terms of parallel processing, that then all of a sudden it becomes a real pain. Yeah. So, but like many other things in life, you realize those things just kind of when you're really already into it, and that's why I'd like to put that out at this place. Scalability. That's also something that. So when you go to the cloud, the tricky part about the cloud is when you look on these websites of these providers, they all start at $19 a month or something like that, or something affordable, right? And then you start with that, and then you write more tests, and you're like, but now it's too slow, so I need a little bit more parallel processing capacity. And then that's the moment when you have to open up your wallet again or pull out your credit card and pay for more parallel processing, right? So especially when you go into the enterprise license segment, those parallel slots are usually restricted to a certain number, and that depends on how much you are willing to pay. Yeah, and so that means if you have 1,000 tests and you have an enterprise license with one of these providers, they still only give you a number 8, 10 tests in parallel. Again, it depends on how much you're willing to pay, but that's basically where it starts. And if you want 25 or 50, you really need to open up your wallet to make that happen, right? So that at any point in time, you can use 50 browsers of their infrastructure. Makes sense, right? Because I mean, that's they don't just provide it to you; they also provide it to other companies. So these cloud providers don't want that you spin up your 10,000 tests and basically bring their system to a halt. Yeah. So that's usually the pricing model, and that really restricts the scalability. But I mean, depending on how much you're willing to spend, right? But again, it's sometimes a little bit deceiving from the beginning on because it seems so cheap. But then when you actually get into the range where it becomes usable from a continuous integration perspective, that's when you really have to then pay. Yeah? Which again, for some companies is okay. But if you think you can get it for $19, not going to happen. Yeah? Now, of course, on the other hand, if you say, I'm going to build this myself, that's perfect, right? Because you can scale as much as you want. All you need, in the end, is processing power. Yeah? You buy, I mean, okay, you still have to buy the servers and all that, but in the end, it's completely up to you. There's nobody telling you, no, you only get 10 slots or 20 or whatever. Yeah? So that's the great thing when you build these things yourself. But of course, it comes with all the other baggage attached to it. Performance. I'm always a little bit surprised that most companies that we work with, they have their code in-house. They have their CI system in-house. They have the application under test in-house. Everything's running in-house. And then all of a sudden they say, oh yeah, but that piece in the middle where where the browsers are actually running and executing the tests, that we put out in the cloud. So that's usually, it's not surprising, but I always question if that's a good approach, right? I mean, why not put your code into the cloud, or why not put your CI into the cloud? It's usually people say, because it's too slow. And that's the same thing when you put your browsers into the cloud. Yeah. So everyone who has looked a little bit deeper into the Selenium protocol, so everything you do, like every command that you execute, so you're trying to find an element, you're clicking on a button, you're pulling some information from an element, every single one of those commands results in an HTTP request to the browser. Yeah. And now that makes a huge difference whether your browser is in Moscow with everything else, right? Or whether your browser is in San Francisco, where it has to travel halfway around the globe to say, hey, can you give me some attribute of an element, and then travel all the way back to you again, right? That's a huge, and I mean, this is exactly when latency starts to kick in. Right? Usually you don't, when you load a website, it's no big deal if it takes maybe a second or two longer. But if for absolutely every command you have to go back and forth around the globe, that really adds up. Yeah. So again, it's not a no-go. It's just something that you have to be prepared to accept, that if you go the cloud way, the performance is very likely going to be slower. And it all depends, of course, where your servers are sitting, right? So if your application under test is also close to a location where that cloud provider has their infrastructure, okay, then it's less of a problem, right? But most companies, as I said, have their stuff in-house, and then they go 13,000 kilometers in one way or the other way to pull an element. And of course, with in-house solutions, again, everything's very, very close together. Yeah. So again, up to you. I mean, these things are definitely worth to try out, right? I mean, I can't tell you whether or how much slower or faster one way or the other is, but before you sign the big enterprise license with a cloud provider, or before you hire 5 people, you should think about these things. So if you want to hire 5 people to build something like that in-house, right? So those are all the things that probably make sense to evaluate before you start. Pricing. Well, simple, right? In the cloud, you pay. The price lists are, well, most of the prices are available, and then usually when it becomes interesting, that's when it says contact us. Right? So those prices are not public oftentimes, but I mean, it's just a matter of basically saying this is what I need, and then they come back with a price to you. So that's all good. And exactly, so they guarantee service levels, right? They say, yes, of course, you always have 10 browsers available for yourself. I don't know, I haven't read through the terms and conditions, but there's basically, it's you buy a service from them, and there's SLAs attached to it, so that's okay. When you build it in-house, that's what I mentioned before, people think it's free. It's not, because they need to pay for you, right? And that's also a significant cost, right? And so one thing is the cost that's attached to that. And the other thing is the opportunity cost, right? Where you're not, maybe you're going to spend a week on sorting out the Gecko driver issue, where you could have probably just written some kick-ass tests. Yeah, and I think that's the. Sorry, I don't know how you translate kick-ass. Sorry. Yeah, so that's the opportunity cost that also goes into the equation. Yeah. Bottom line is both approaches cost money. right? One is maybe a little bit more visible and tangible, and the other one, when you do it in-house, it's maybe a little bit more hidden. Reporting and monitoring. As much fun as it is to look at a stack trace of your test, especially when it failed, it probably is a nice thing if you're able to have screenshots of, of your test, especially when it fails, or maybe even a video, right? To be able to say, okay, can you just replay this test and see where it failed, or just even to get an idea of what does it look like, right? Because in a Selenium Grid, you're not running it locally, you're not running a local browser, you're running it in a black box somewhere, right? So that's something that also you really need to think about is, the cloud providers, they provide that, that functionality. You can take videos, you can download them, you can take screenshots. When you build these things in-house, you have to put in that additional functionality yourself, right? And again, it's interesting to do that, but it takes effort. Yeah. And also maybe you're interested in seeing, okay, team A ran this many tests, team B ran that many tests. Maybe you want to do things like you want to give priority to the CI system. Yeah? Could be that you say, okay, whenever the CI system runs, that has precedence over me when I just want to run a few tests from my dev machine, right? Those kind of things. Think about if you need them, right? Or if you may need them, and then evaluate whether the solution that you're targeting is actually able to provide that. Okay. And I think the last one, the last bullet I have, is target applications. So Selenium is web, right? But of course there's also Appium. Yeah? Anybody worked with Appium? So it's Selenium, right? In the end, it's just for mobile. And that's also something, right? So when you can, for mobile web applications, it's okay. You can say, I'm going to resize the browser to a certain size, and that gives you a little bit of an idea of the whole responsive behavior of your application. But when you want to test native apps, that becomes really difficult, right? Because there's no browser. So you take your APK file or your app file or your IPA file, and you have to put that onto either an emulator, simulator, or actually a device. Right? So, just out of interest, how do you guys do that? Like, do you run these emulators and devices locally, or do you use a cloud service? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Which means, you take your phone, you plug it into your machine. Just simple things. A lot of financial institutions, they are completely bound to Microsoft Windows, right? So when you say I need a Mac because I'm actually building an iPhone app and I need a Mac hardware to spin up a simulator, they're like, no, that's how would we do that, right? Because it just doesn't fit into their world. So so these are all things you need to think about, and of course the cloud does provide you that, right? There's cloud companies out there that say you can just like with browsers, we give you devices, we give you emulators, simulators, yeah, whatever. So that's all out there. One word of caution: if you can build the web piece in-house. That's doable, right? It requires effort, but it's doable. What is really, really difficult is actually building the mobile infrastructure, right? That's kind of untapped terrain at this point. It's fairly new. So to build an infrastructure that, that what we've seen with the requirements that it has to scale and et cetera, that's very, very difficult to do. So you need to be aware of that. If that's something, if you need mobile, yeah, and when you need mobile, in which kind of packaging you need it. For example, I just recently worked with a client. They went for a cloud solution for the web, bought a big enterprise license, and then 2 months down the road, they realized, we don't have mobile in there, right? But they're building mobile apps, so mobile web and mobile and native apps. So they just threw away a lot of money for something that they can't even use. Yeah. So, yeah. Again, just like everything else in life, think about these things before. All right. Now, to summarize, there is no perfect solution out there, of course, right? Both alleys have their pros and cons. Yeah. I think what's important, if you build and maintain and run these systems in-house, you have full control over everything you do, right? It may be just even simple things like who's working with unsigned self-signed SSL certificates. Yeah. So problem is if you do that, that usually brings up this nasty error that says untrusted connection, and you need to manually click on something, right? If you send a test like that to the cloud, that will do the same thing, and the cloud operators will not implement a custom solution for you, right? So if you have those kind of things, you actually have to do it yourself. So point is, you have full control over what you support and these custom little things, right? But of course, it takes a lot of effort, right? It's rewarding work, as I mentioned. It's really cool to do it if you're into that kind of stuff. The scalability aspect is there, right? You can scale as much as you want just by simply adding more servers or processing power. Yeah, that's if you do it yourself. The other side, the cloud, you kind of know what you pay for. Right, so there's a contract. There's not like, oh, we underestimated this, so now so from the cloud provider perspective, we're going to charge you more. I mean, you say, this is the service that I want to buy, and they send you the invoice. Yeah? You don't have any maintenance. That's really great, right? And the performance, something you need to really check whether that is a problem or not, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying cloud is slow, but there's a potential that the cloud is slow. So something you should certainly check. I mean, we always say, just try it out. I mean, all these providers give you test accounts, right? So you can check it out for 30 days and see, yeah, do they actually keep their promise? What's on the PowerPoint and the sales presentations, right? That they show you. Good. And just want to see one last thing. Yeah, the security aspect, of course, right? I think that really, when you think about the cloud, think about security, if it's acceptable or not. Yeah? And that may be a very quick and simple answer to that. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. There's one last thing I want to show you. If you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I said we developed Selenium Grid and invented the Selenium box. Now, for those people who are wondering, so now what is this Selenium box thing? It's basically so. I'm not here to sell you the product. I just want to make you aware that it's out there. It's basically an in-house managed cloud, right? So it kind of brings together the best of both worlds, right? So where you run this infrastructure in-house, but you don't have to actually worry about the Gecko drivers and all of that. Yeah? So if you want to check that out, that's up there. I'm assuming that the slides are distributed to the attendants. Who would know that? Okay, I'm assuming they will be. So you can read through that as well. And with that, I would like to say thank you.